The helicopter blades chopped through the Afghan night air like angry wasps. Inside the Black Hawk, 24-year-old Navy hospital corpsman Sarah Chen checked her medical kit for the third time. Her hands moved with practiced precision, counting bandages, checking IV bags, and ensuring every piece of life-saving equipment was exactly where it should be. The SEALs around her sat in focused silence, their faces painted black, weapons ready. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison watched Sarah from across the cramped cabin. In the 18 months she had been assigned to SEAL Team 7, he had never seen her panic, never seen her hands shake, never heard her voice crack under pressure. The guys called her Doc, with the kind of respect usually reserved for seasoned warriors who had proven themselves in combat dozens of times over. At barely 5 feet 4 inches and weighing maybe 120 pounds soaking wet, Sarah looked like she belonged in a college library, not in the middle of a war zone. But Morrison knew better. The mission tonight was supposed to be routine. Intelligence had located a Taliban commander in a small village outside Kandahar. The man was responsible for coordinating attacks on coalition forces and had been moving weapons through the region for months. The plan was simple. Fast insertion. Capture the target. Extract any useful intelligence. And get out before anyone knew they were there. Sarah had run through dozens of these missions. Her job was to stay with the helicopter, ready to treat any wounded team members when they returned. She had treated everything from minor cuts to life-threatening injuries. Always calm, always focused, always bringing her teammates home alive. The SEALs trusted her completely, and trust in a unit like this was something you earned through blood, sweat, and countless hours of training together. As the helicopter descended toward the landing zone, Sarah felt the familiar knot in her stomach. Not fear exactly, but the heightened awareness that came with knowing that in the next few hours, someone's life might depend entirely on what she did with her hands and her training. She had joined the Navy to save lives, and serving with the SEALs had given her that opportunity in ways she never could have imagined. The helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust. The SEALs moved out quickly and silently, disappearing into the darkness like shadows. Sarah watched them go, then settled in to wait. The pilot kept the engines running at idle, ready for a quick departure. The night was quiet, except for the distant sound of dogs barking in the village. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Sarah's radio crackled with occasional updates from the team. They had reached the target building. They were setting up positions. Everything was going according to plan. She allowed herself to relax slightly, thinking this might be one of those missions where she would spend the entire night sitting in a helicopter, bored but grateful that no one needed her medical skills. That was when the first explosion lit up the night sky. The radio erupted with voices, multiple contacts, heavy resistance. The Taliban commander had been expecting them, and the simple capture mission had just turned into a full-scale firefight. Sarah could hear the distinctive crack of AK-47 seconds, mixing with the deeper boom of American weapons. Muzzle flashes strobed in the darkness like deadly fireworks. "Doc, we've got wounded." Morrison's voice came through her headset, strained but controlled. "Prepare for multiple casualties." Molsted. Of the Bard. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She began laying out medical supplies, setting up triage areas in the helicopter, preparing for the worst. Her heart rate spiked, but her hands remained steady. This was what she had trained for, what she had prepared for through hundreds of hours of medical drills and combat scenarios. The first SEAL came running out of the darkness, half carrying, half dragging his wounded teammate. Petty Officer Mike Rodriguez had taken shrapnel in his leg and was losing blood fast. Sarah pulled him into the helicopter and went to work immediately, cutting away his uniform, applying pressure bandages, starting an IV line. Rodriguez was conscious but pale, his face tight with pain. "You're going to be fine," Sarah told him, her voice calm and reassuring even as her hands worked quickly to stop the bleeding. "Just a flesh wound. You'll be back annoying everyone in a week." Rodriguez managed a weak smile. "Thanks, Doc. I knew you'd take care of me." The second wounded SEAL was in worse shape. Sergeant Tom Bradley had taken a round through his shoulder that had nicked an artery. Blood was pumping out of the wound in rhythmic spurts that meant Sarah had maybe minutes to save his life. She worked frantically, applying direct pressure, trying to clamp the damaged vessel, pushing fluids to keep his blood pressure up. "Stay with me, Bradley," she said, leaning close to his ear. "Your wife is going to kill me if I let anything happen to you. Think about getting home to see your kids." More SEALs emerged from the village, providing covering fire for their wounded teammates. The radio traffic indicated the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The Taliban had reinforcements coming, and the team was in danger of being overrun. Sarah had just stabilized Bradley when Morrison's voice crackled through her headset again. "Doc, we've got a problem. Peterson is hit bad, and we can't get to him. He's pinned down about 200 meters from our position, and we're taking too much fire to reach him." Sarah looked up from her patient. Through the open helicopter door, she could see muzzle flashes in the distance, could hear the constant chatter of automatic weapons. Petty Officer Jack Peterson was one of the youngest members of the team, just 22 years old, with a new baby daughter he had never met. He was also the team's point man, always the first one through the door, always taking the most dangerous assignments. "How bad is he hit?" Sarah asked. "Hard to tell from here, but he's not moving, and there's a lot of blood." "Doc, we need you to do something you've never done before. We need you to come get him." Sarah felt ice in her veins. In all her missions with the team, she had never left the helicopter. Her job was to be the safe harbor, the place where wounded SEALs could come to get patched up before being evacuated. Going into an active firefight to retrieve a wounded teammate was not part of her job description, but looking at Rodriguez and Bradley, both of whom owed their lives to her quick medical intervention, Sarah knew there wasn't really a choice. Peterson was her teammate. Her responsibility. If he was going to survive, someone had to reach him in the next few minutes. And she was the only one with the medical training to keep him alive long enough to get back to the helicopter. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. Morrison's voice was grim. "We'll lay down covering fire and create a corridor for you to reach him." "But Doc, this isn't a medical mission anymore. You're going to have to fight your way to him and fight your way back. Are you ready for that?" Sarah looked at the two wounded SEALs in the helicopter, both watching her with expressions of complete trust. She thought about Peterson bleeding somewhere in the darkness, probably scared, definitely in pain, maybe dying. She thought about the oath she had taken when she became a medic, the promise to save lives no matter what the cost. "I'm ready," she said, reaching for her rifle. Sarah had qualified expert with both the M4 carbine and the M9 pistol during her training, but she had never fired a shot in combat. Her weapons had been for self-defense only, a last resort if everything else went wrong. Tonight, everything had gone wrong. She checked her rifle, making sure it was loaded and ready. She grabbed her medical bag, the lightweight version she could carry while moving fast. She took a deep breath, feeling her heart hammering against her ribs. "Doc," Rodriguez called out weakly from his stretcher. "Bring our boy home." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She looked at the pilot. "If we don't make it back in 15 minutes, get these two to the hospital. Don't wait for us." The pilot, a grizzled veteran of dozens of combat missions, looked at her with something like awe. "Yes, ma'am. We'll be here when you get back." Sarah stepped out of the helicopter into the Afghan night. The air smelled of gunpowder and dust. Tracer rounds streaked overhead like deadly shooting stars. The sound of gunfire was much louder outside the helicopter, a constant crackling that seemed to come from every direction. Morrison appeared at her side, his face invisible under his night vision goggles. "Stay close to me, Doc. We move fast. We move quiet. And we don't stop until we reach Peterson. You ready?" Sarah nodded, her throat too dry to speak. She followed Morrison into the darkness, leaving behind the relative safety of the helicopter and entering a world where death could come from any shadow, where every step forward was a step deeper into danger. Behind them, the helicopter waited, engines running, ready for a quick departure. Inside, Rodriguez and Bradley watched through the open door as their medic disappeared into the night, carrying nothing but her medical training, her rifle, and a determination to bring their teammate home alive. The mission had started as a simple capture operation. Now it had become something else entirely. Now it was about family, about the bonds that held a team together, about a young woman who was about to discover that sometimes the line between saving lives and taking them was thinner than anyone wanted to believe. In the distance, Peterson lay bleeding and alone, waiting for help that he didn't even know was coming. Between him and rescue lay 200 meters of enemy territory, Taliban fighters who would kill anyone who tried to reach him, and a medic who was about to learn that in war, everyone fights, everyone bleeds, and everyone has to make choices they never thought they would face. The firefight that would change Sarah Chen forever had only just begun. Sarah followed Morrison through the maze of mud brick walls and narrow alleys that made up the village's outer edge. Every shadow could hide an enemy fighter. Every doorway could conceal a sniper. Her medical training had taught her to think systematically, to approach problems step by step, to stay calm under pressure. But nothing had prepared her for the chaos of urban combat. The weight of her rifle felt strange in her hands. For 18 months, it had been just another piece of equipment she carried, like her stethoscope or her trauma shears. Now, it was the difference between life and death, between completing her mission and never seeing home again. She tried to remember everything she had learned in basic training about combat movement, about staying low, about watching for threats. Morrison held up his fist, the universal signal to freeze. Sarah pressed herself against a crumbling wall, her heart hammering so loud she was sure every Taliban fighter in the village could hear it. Through her earpiece, she could hear the voices of the other SEALs, coordinating their movements, calling out enemy positions, trying to create the corridor of covering fire that would get her to Peterson. 2 tangos on the rooftop northeast corner, came Sergeant Williams's voice. I've got eyes on them. The sharp crack of Williams's sniper rifle cut through the night. One of the enemy fighters on the rooftop spun and fell. The other ducked back behind cover, but not before Sarah caught a glimpse of his muzzle flash. These weren't the scattered, disorganized fighters she had expected. They were disciplined, well-positioned, and they knew exactly what they were doing. Morrison turned to look at her, his face invisible behind his night vision goggles. He leaned close so she could hear him over the gunfire. Peterson's in that building, about 50 meters ahead. We're going to bound forward, one at a time. I move first, then you follow. When I give the signal, you run like hell, and don't stop until you reach that doorway. Understood? Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. 50 meters didn't sound like much when you said it out loud, but 50 meters across open ground, under enemy fire, with people shooting at you from multiple directions, might as well have been 50 miles. Morrison checked his weapon one more time, then sprinted forward, his form barely visible in the darkness. Sarah watched him go. Counting seconds in her head, he made it to a pile of rubble about halfway to their destination, then turned and gave her the signal. Sarah ran. Time seemed to slow down as her feet pounded across the hard-packed earth. She could hear bullets cracking through the air around her, could see dirt kicking up. Where rounds impacted near her feet, her medical bag bounced against her hip with every step. Her rifle felt impossibly heavy in her hands. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice was screaming that this was insane, that she was a medic, not a combat soldier, that she was going to get herself killed. But a louder voice, the voice of 18 months of training and bonding with her team, told her that Peterson was counting on her, that Rodriguez and Bradley were watching from the helicopter, trusting her to bring their teammate home, that sometimes being a medic meant running toward danger instead of away from it. She reached Morrison's position and threw herself down behind the rubble, gasping for breath. She had made it halfway. Now came the hard part. You okay? Morrison asked. Sarah nodded, surprised to find that she actually was okay. The sprint across open ground under fire had been terrifying. But she had done it. She was still alive, still moving, still focused on the mission. Peterson's in that building right there, Morrison said, pointing to a single-story structure about 25 meters away. Ground floor, back room. He took a round in the chest, and another in the leg. He's conscious but losing blood fast. We've got maybe 10 minutes before he goes into shock. Sarah looked at the building. The walls were pockmarked with bullet holes. The windows were dark. There was no movement visible. But that didn't mean anything. The Taliban could have fighters inside, waiting for anyone foolish enough to try a rescue. "How do we get in?" she asked. Morrison smiled grimly. "Fast and loud. We're going to put everything we've got into that building for 30 seconds. Then you go in and get him. I'll be right behind you." Sarah's radio crackled. Williams's voice came through clearly. "I've got movement in the building next to your target. At least 3 fighters, maybe more. They're positioning to ambush anyone who goes in." Morrison cursed under his breath. The situation was getting worse by the minute. They were running out of time, running out of options, and running out of ammunition. Pretty soon, the Taliban reinforcements would arrive, and the entire team would be cut off from their extraction point. "Change of plans," Morrison said. "Williams, can you put rounds into that building where you saw the movement?" "Roger that. Give me 30 seconds." Sarah watched as Williams's sniper rifle spoke again, the muzzle flash barely visible from his concealed position. Through the darkness, she could hear the distinctive whine of ricochets as his bullets tore through the building where the ambush had been waiting. "Building's clear," Williams reported. "But you've got more company coming from the north. I count at least 6 fighters moving your way." Morrison looked at Sarah. "This is it, Doc. We go now. Or we don't go at all. You still with me?" Sarah thought about Peterson, bleeding and alone in that building. She thought about her oath as a medic, her promise to do no harm but also to preserve life wherever she found it. She thought about the trust the SEALs had placed in her, the way they had accepted her as one of their own despite her size, her gender, her role as a non-combatant. "I'm with you," she said. Morrison nodded. "On my count. 3, 2, 1. Go!" They sprinted toward the building as the rest of the team opened fire, pouring bullets into every window, every doorway, every position where an enemy fighter might be hiding. The noise was overwhelming, a constant thunder of automatic weapons that drowned out everything else. Sarah reached the building's doorway and pressed herself against the wall, breathing hard. Morrison was right beside her, checking his rifle, preparing to go inside. Through the doorway, she could see a narrow hallway leading deeper into the building. "Peterson," Morrison called out. "Doc's here. Where are you?" A weak voice answered from somewhere in the back of the building. "Here. Back room. Hurry." Morrison went through the doorway first, his rifle ready. Sarah followed, her medical training taking over despite her fear. She could smell blood in the air, could hear Peterson's labored breathing from the back of the building. They found him in what had once been a small storage room. Peterson was propped against a wall, his uniform soaked with blood, his face pale but alert. He had applied a field dressing to his chest wound, but it was already soaked through. His leg wound was worse, a through and through that had nicked the femoral artery. "About time you got here," Peterson said, trying to smile. "I was starting to think you'd forgotten about me." Sarah dropped to her knees beside him, already pulling supplies from her medical bag. "Sorry we're late. Traffic was horrible." She went to work immediately, cutting away his uniform, exposing the wounds so she could assess the damage. The chest wound was bad but not immediately life-threatening. The bullet had passed through his lung without hitting any major blood vessels. The leg wound was the real problem. Blood was pumping out steadily, and Peterson had already lost too much. "I need to get a tourniquet on that leg," Sarah said, working quickly. "This is going to hurt." "Do it," Peterson said through gritted teeth. Sarah positioned the tourniquet above the wound and began tightening it. Peterson's face went white, and he bit down hard on his lower lip to keep from screaming. But the bleeding slowed, then stopped. "Good," Sarah said. "That'll hold until we get you to the helicopter. Can you walk?" Peterson tried to stand but collapsed back against the wall. "Negative. Leg won't hold me." Morrison appeared in the doorway. "Doc, we've got problems. Those reinforcements Williams spotted? They're here, and they've got us surrounded. We're not walking out of here." Sarah looked up from her patient. "What do you mean?" "I mean we're trapped. The Taliban have fighters on every side of this building. They're not attacking yet, but they're waiting for something. Probably more reinforcements. Maybe heavy weapons. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Afghan night air. They were trapped in an enemy-controlled village, with a wounded teammate who couldn't walk, surrounded by fighters who would show no mercy if they were captured. "How long before extraction arrives?" she asked. Morrison checked his watch. "Not soon enough. The helicopter can't land under fire, and we can't reach the landing zone carrying Peterson." Sarah looked down at her patient. Peterson was watching her with complete trust, the same expression she had seen on dozens of wounded SEALs over the past 18 months. They believed she would find a way to save them, no matter what the odds, no matter what the cost. "Options?" she asked Morrison. "We fight our way out," he said grimly. "All of us, Peterson included." Sarah shook her head. "He can't fight. He's lost too much blood, and that chest wound affects his breathing. If he tries to move fast or exert himself, he could go into shock." "Then what do you suggest?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Outside, she could hear the Taliban fighters calling to each other, coordinating their positions, tightening the noose around the building. Time was running out, and every second they delayed made their situation worse. Then an idea began to form in her mind. It was crazy, probably suicidal, but it might work. It depended on the Taliban making assumptions about who they were fighting, about what they were up against. It depended on Sarah doing something she had never done before, something that went against every instinct she had developed as a medic. "Give me your sniper rifle," she said to Morrison. Morrison stared at her. "What?" "Your rifle, the one with the long-range scope. Give it to me." "Doc, you're a medic. You don't—" "I qualify expert marksman with every weapon in the Navy inventory," Sarah interrupted. "I just never had a reason to use those skills before." "Give me the rifle." Morrison hesitated, then handed over his weapon. It was a modified M4 with a high-powered scope, capable of accurate fire out to 800 meters. Sarah checked the action, familiarized herself with the scope settings, estimated the available ammunition. "What's your plan?" Morrison asked. Sarah looked up at him, her face grim with determination. "You said they're not attacking yet. They're waiting for something. My guess is they want to take us alive, maybe use us as bargaining chips or propaganda tools. That means they're being careful, methodical. So they're not expecting what I'm about to give them. They're expecting a cornered medic who's going to hide behind her teammates and wait for rescue. They're not expecting someone who's going to start picking them off one by one from a concealed position." Morrison stared at her for a long moment. "Doc, if you start shooting, this becomes a different kind of fight. They'll stop trying to take us alive. They'll bring everything they've got down on this building." Sarah nodded. "I know. But if we stay here, we're dead anyway. At least this way, we go down fighting." She moved to the window, staying low, using the scope to scan the buildings around them. Through the green glow of the night vision, she could see Taliban fighters positioned on rooftops, in doorways, behind walls. They were confident, patient, sure they had their prey trapped. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Sarah picked her first target. A fighter on a rooftop about 200 meters away. He was standing in the open, probably feeling safe at that distance, probably thinking no one could see him in the darkness. Sarah took a deep breath, let half of it out, and gently squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. Through the scope, she watched the Taliban fighter spin and fall. The other fighters around him looked around in confusion, not sure where the shot had come from. Sarah was already selecting her second target. The medic who had spent 18 months saving lives was about to discover she had a talent for taking them. Sarah's second shot dropped a Taliban fighter who had been crouching behind a low wall, thinking he was completely hidden. The man had been holding a rocket-propelled grenade launcher, probably waiting for orders to use it against their building. Now the weapon lay useless beside his still form. The enemy fighters began to react, but they were confused, disorganized. They had expected a desperate firefight at close range, not precise sniper fire from a concealed position. Sarah could hear them shouting to each other, trying to figure out where the shots were coming from. "Holy hell, Doc," Morrison whispered from behind her. Where did you learn to shoot like that? Sarah worked the bolt of the rifle, chambering another round. Her hands were steady, her breathing controlled. The terror she had felt running across open ground was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating focus that surprised her. My father was a Marine sniper in Vietnam, she said quietly. He taught me to shoot when I was 12. Said every American should know how to defend themselves and their country. She found her third target, a fighter who was trying to move from one building to another. The man was running in a crouch, probably thinking he was moving too fast to be hit. Sarah led him slightly, compensating for his movement and the distance, then squeezed the trigger. The man stumbled and fell, his rifle clattering away across the stone pavement. 3 down, Sarah reported, her voice calm and professional. I can see at least 8 more. But they're starting to take cover. Peterson, despite his wounds, was watching her with amazement. Doc, I've seen some incredible shooting in my time. But this is something else. You're picking them off like you've been doing this for years. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She was scanning for her next target, looking for any enemy fighter who presented a clear shot. What she saw made her blood run cold. A group of Taliban fighters was setting up a heavy machine gun on a rooftop about 300 meters away. Once they got that weapon operational, they could pour devastating fire into the building where she and her teammates were trapped. Morrison, we've got a problem, she said. Heavy machine gun, northeast rooftop. They're almost finished setting it up. Morrison looked through his binoculars. I see it. That's a PKM, Russian-made. Once they get that thing firing, we're finished. Can you take out the gunners? Sarah studied the position through her scope. The machine gun team consisted of 3 men. A gunner, an assistant gunner, and an ammunition bearer. They were working efficiently, professionally. These weren't untrained village fighters. These were experienced combat soldiers, probably veterans of years of fighting against coalition forces. The range was long, nearly at the limit of her rifle's effective accuracy. The targets were partially concealed behind sandbags and concrete blocks. She would get maybe 1 clear shot before the survivors took cover and returned fire. I can try, Sarah said. But I need to take the gunner first. If I miss, they'll have that weapon operational in seconds. Do what you can, Doc. You're our only chance. Sarah settled into a stable firing position, using the window frame to support her rifle. She controlled her breathing, slowing her heart rate, blocking out everything except the scope picture in front of her. Through the magnified image, she could see the Taliban gunner clearly. He was young, maybe 20 years old, with a thin beard and intense concentration. As he made final adjustments to his weapon, for a moment, Sarah hesitated. In all her medical training, she had sworn to do no harm, to preserve life wherever possible. Now, she was about to take a life, to end someone's future, with a single pull of her trigger. The young man in her crosshairs probably had a family, dreams, people who loved him. Then she thought about Peterson, bleeding and helpless behind her. She thought about Rodriguez and Bradley, waiting in the helicopter, counting on her to bring their teammate home. She thought about all the American soldiers who would die if that machine gun opened fire on them. Sarah squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, and through her scope she saw the Taliban gunner collapse across his weapon. The assistant gunner looked around frantically, trying to locate the source of the shot while simultaneously attempting to push his dead comrade aside and take over the gun. Sarah worked the bolt and fired again. The assistant gunner spun and fell. The ammunition bearer grabbed the gun and tried to swing it toward Sarah's building, but he was panicked, unfamiliar with the weapon's operation. Sarah's third shot ended his efforts permanently. Machine gun neutralized, she reported. Morrison stared at her with something approaching awe. Doc, in 15 years of special operations, I have never seen shooting like that. You just took out an entire machine gun team at 300 meters, in the dark, under combat stress. Sarah was already looking for her next target. The Taliban fighters were adapting to her presence, becoming more careful about exposing themselves, but they were also becoming more aggressive. Realizing that their overwhelming numerical advantage meant nothing, as long as she could pick them off one by one from a concealed position. "They're going to try to rush us," she said. "I can see them massing in that building to the south. Maybe 10 or 12 fighters." Morrison checked his weapon and ammunition. "How many rounds do you have left?" Sarah checked her magazine. 6 in the rifle, 1 more full magazine. 26 rounds total. "That's not enough. Not if they rush us all at once." Sarah nodded grimly. She had bought them time. But time was running out. The Taliban fighters were learning from their losses, becoming more cautious, more professional in their approach. Soon they would coordinate a simultaneous assault from multiple directions, and no amount of accurate shooting would be enough to stop them all. "What's our extraction status?" she asked. Morrison listened to his radio for a moment. "Helicopter is standing by. But they can't reach us with all this ground fire. The pilot says they need at least 5 minutes of clear airspace to get in and out safely." "5 minutes," Sarah repeated. "I can give you 5 minutes." She returned to her scope, searching for targets. The Taliban fighters were being much more careful now, moving quickly from cover to cover, never exposing themselves for more than a few seconds at a time. Sarah managed to wound one fighter who moved too slowly, but she could feel the initiative slipping away from her. Then she saw something that made her stomach clench with fear. A Taliban fighter was carrying what looked like a shoulder-fired missile launcher, probably a Russian-made RPG-7. If he could get into position to use it, he could bring down their extraction helicopter or collapse the building they were hiding in. "RPG," she called out, tracking the fighter through her scope. "Moving toward that alley where he'll have a clear shot at our building." Sarah followed the man's movement, waiting for him to pause long enough for a clear shot. But he was smart, experienced. He moved in short bursts, never staying exposed for more than a second or two. Sarah had to admire his tactical skill even as she tried to kill him. The fighter reached the alley and began setting up his weapon. Sarah could see him clearly through her scope, but he was partially concealed behind a concrete barrier. She would have to wait for him to expose himself to fire his RPG. "Doc, whatever you're going to do it now," Morrison said urgently. "I can hear him preparing to fire." Sarah steadied her rifle, centering her crosshairs on the edge of the barrier where she expected the fighter to appear. She controlled her breathing, slowed her heart rate, became one with her weapon. This was the most important shot of her life. Miss, and the RPG would probably kill all 3 of them. The fighter rose up, shouldering his launcher, aiming at their building. Sarah fired. The bullet took the man in the center of his chest, just as he pulled the trigger on his RPG. The rocket motor ignited, but the launcher was already falling from his hands. The missile corkscrewed wildly through the air, before impacting harmlessly against a distant building. "RPG gunner down," Sarah reported. But her relief was short-lived. The sound of the exploding rocket had served as a signal for the Taliban assault. From 3 different directions, enemy fighters began moving toward their building, firing as they advanced. The careful, methodical approach was over. Now, it was a desperate race against time. Sarah worked her rifle frantically, trying to slow the advance. She dropped 2 fighters who were crossing open ground, wounded a third who ducked back into cover. But there were too many of them, coming from too many directions. Her small-caliber rifle, devastating at long range against individual targets, wasn't enough to stop a coordinated assault. "They're at the building," Morrison shouted, moving to cover the doorway with his rifle. "Doc, we need to move Peterson now, or we're all dead." Sarah looked at her wounded teammate. Peterson had lost consciousness, probably from blood loss and shock. Moving him would be dangerous, maybe fatal, but staying here would definitely be fatal for all of them. "Help me get him up," she said, slinging her rifle and grabbing Peterson under one arm. Morrison took the other arm, and together they lifted Peterson to his feet. The young SEAL's head lolled forward, and his breathing was shallow and rapid. Sarah knew the signs of severe shock. Peterson needed immediate medical attention, blood transfusions, surgery. What he was getting instead was a desperate flight through enemy-controlled territory. The sound of gunfire from the front of the building indicated that Taliban fighters were already inside. Sarah could hear their voices, shouting orders, coordinating their search. In a matter of seconds, they would reach the back room where she and her teammates were trapped. "Window," Morrison said. "We go out the back window." Sarah looked at the narrow opening. It would be a tight fit, especially carrying Peterson. And beyond the window lay unknown territory. Probably more enemy fighters, definitely more danger. But it was their only chance. Morrison went first, his rifle ready. Sarah passed Peterson through the window to him, then squeezed through herself. They were in a narrow alley behind the building, surrounded by high walls and deep shadows. Sarah could hear the Taliban fighters in the room they had just escaped, shouting in frustration when they found it empty. "Which way?" Morrison asked. Sarah oriented herself, trying to remember the route back to the helicopter landing zone. It was at least 400 meters away, through streets that were probably crawling with enemy fighters, carrying Peterson. Moving at night, under fire, their chances of making it were almost zero. But almost zero was better than definitely zero. "Northeast," she said. "Stay along the walls, use whatever cover we can find." They began moving, Morrison leading the way, Sarah carrying most of Peterson's weight. The young SEAL was still unconscious, his breathing growing more labored with each step. Sarah knew he was dying, knew that every minute they delayed reduced his chances of survival. Behind them, the sound of angry voices indicated that the Taliban fighters had discovered their escape route. Soon those voices would turn into pursuit, and the hunt would begin in earnest. Sarah adjusted her grip on Peterson's limp form and followed Morrison into the maze of alleys that led toward extraction. She still had her rifle, still had some ammunition left. If they were lucky, if they were smart, if they were willing to fight for every meter of ground, they might make it out alive. The medic had become a sniper. Now she had to become something else entirely. A soldier fighting her way home. The alley stretched ahead like a tunnel through hostile territory. Every shadow could conceal an enemy fighter. Every doorway could hide an ambush. Sarah shifted Peterson's weight against her shoulder, feeling his blood soaking through her uniform. The young SEAL was unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. She estimated he had lost at least 2 units of blood, maybe more. Without immediate medical intervention, he would go into irreversible shock within the next 10 minutes. Morrison moved ahead of them, his rifle ready, checking each corner before advancing. The sound of pursuit was growing louder behind them. Angry voices, running feet, the distinctive rattle of AK-47 seconds being prepared for action. The Taliban fighters had discovered their escape route and were organizing a systematic hunt through the village. "Contact front," Morrison whispered urgently, dropping to one knee and raising his rifle. Sarah pulled Peterson against a wall, trying to make them both invisible in the shadows. Through the darkness ahead, she could see movement. 2 Taliban fighters were crossing the alley about 50 meters away, moving from one building to another. They hadn't seen the escaping Americans yet, but they were blocking the most direct route to the helicopter landing zone. Morrison lined up his shot, but before he could fire, one of the fighters turned and looked directly toward their position. The man's eyes widened in surprise, and he began to raise his rifle. Sarah moved without thinking. She transferred Peterson's weight to Morrison, brought up her rifle, and fired twice in rapid succession. Both Taliban fighters dropped where they stood. "Nice shooting," Morrison said grimly. "But that's going to bring more of them running." Sure enough, shouts erupted from nearby buildings as other fighters responded to the gunfire. Sarah could hear boots pounding on stone streets, voices calling out grid references and directions in Pashto. The net was tightening around them. "How far to extraction?" she asked, taking Peterson's weight again. Morrison checked his GPS. 300 meters. But we can't go direct. Too much open ground. We need to work our way around through these back alleys. Sarah nodded, though she knew every detour cost them precious time they didn't have. Peterson's condition was deteriorating rapidly. His pulse was weak and racing, his skin cold and clammy. Classic signs of hemorrhagic shock. If they didn't reach medical facilities soon, he would die regardless of whether they escaped the Taliban. They resumed movement, staying close to the walls, pausing at every intersection to check for threats. Sarah's world had narrowed to the immediate. The weight of Peterson's body against her shoulder, the sound of their breathing, the feel of her rifle in her free hand. Everything else was background noise. At the next corner, Morrison held up his fist. Sarah froze, listening. She could hear voices very close by. Maybe just around the corner. At least 3 men. Maybe more. They were speaking quietly, professionally. These weren't excited village fighters anymore. These were experienced soldiers conducting a methodical search. Morrison tapped his radio and spoke in the lowest possible whisper. "Overlord, this is Bravo 7. We are moving to extraction with one urgent surgical. Request immediate close air support." The response crackled back immediately. "Bravo 7. Overlord. No air assets available in your area. You are on your own until you reach the landing zone." Sarah felt her heart sink. No air support meant no relief from the pressure. No way to break contact with their pursuers. They were truly alone in hostile territory, carrying a critically wounded teammate, being hunted by an unknown number of enemy fighters. The voices around the corner were getting closer. Sarah could make out individual words now. Tactical instructions about search patterns and blocking positions. The Taliban were setting up a perimeter, trying to box them in. Morrison looked at her, his expression grim. "We're going to have to fight our way through." Sarah nodded. She eased Peterson down against a wall, trying to position him so he would be protected if bullets started flying. The young SEAL's eyes fluttered open for a moment. "Doc?" he whispered weakly. "I'm here," Sarah said, leaning close. "You're going to be fine. Just rest." Peterson tried to speak again, but the effort was too much. His eyes closed, and his breathing became even more labored. Sarah checked his pulse. Weak. Irregular. Fading fast. She estimated he had maybe 5 minutes before his cardiovascular system completely shut down. "We need to move now," she told Morrison. Morrison checked his rifle, ensuring he had a full magazine. "On my signal, I'm going to engage the fighters around that corner. While they're focused on me, you take Peterson and move toward that building across the street. There's an alley on the far side that should lead toward the landing zone." Sarah looked at the building Morrison had indicated. It was maybe 30 meters away, across open ground. Carrying Peterson, under fire, it might as well have been 30 miles. "What about you?" she asked. Morrison smiled grimly. "I'll catch up. Just get Peterson to that helicopter." Sarah knew he was lying. Morrison was planning to sacrifice himself to give her and Peterson a chance to escape. It was exactly the kind of selfless courage she had come to expect from the SEALs, and exactly the kind of plan she couldn't accept. "Negative," she said firmly. "We all go together, or nobody goes." Morrison stared at her. "Doc, this isn't a negotiation. I'm giving you an order." "I'm a Navy hospital corpsman, not a SEAL," Sarah replied. "You can't give me orders about medical decisions, and I'm declaring this a medical decision. Moving Peterson alone will kill him. He needs 2 people to carry him safely." For a moment, Morrison looked like he wanted to argue. Then he saw the determination in her eyes, the same look she got when she was working on a critical patient and wouldn't accept anything less than perfection. "Okay," he said finally. "Then we do this together. But Doc, once we start moving, we don't stop. No matter what happens, no matter who gets hit, we don't stop until we reach that helicopter." Sarah nodded. She had made her peace with dying tonight. What she couldn't accept was leaving Peterson behind, or letting Morrison sacrifice himself unnecessarily. They were a team, and teams stayed together. Morrison moved to the corner, his rifle ready. "On 3, he whispered. 1, 2, 3. He rounded the corner, firing, his rifle chattering on full automatic. Sarah heard shouts of surprise and alarm. The sound of return fire. The distinctive crack of bullets passing overhead. She grabbed Peterson under one arm and began dragging him toward the building Morrison had indicated. The 30 meters felt like 30 miles. Peterson was dead weight, unconscious and bleeding. Sarah's rifle bounced against her back as she struggled to move him quickly enough to avoid the gunfire that was now erupting from multiple directions. Behind her, she could hear Morrison engaging multiple targets, his rifle speaking with deadly precision. Halfway across the open space, Sarah felt a bullet tug at her sleeve. Another kicked up dust inches from her feet. The Taliban fighters had spotted her and were trying to cut her down before she could reach cover. "Move, move, move," Morrison shouted from behind her. Sarah reached the building and pulled Peterson into the relative safety of a doorway. She turned to provide covering fire for Morrison, who was bounding toward her position under heavy fire. Muzzle flashes strobed in the darkness as Taliban fighters emerged from concealment to engage them. Sarah brought up her rifle and began returning fire, trying to suppress the enemy shooters long enough for Morrison to reach safety. She wasn't thinking about marksmanship now, just laying down enough fire to make the Taliban fighters duck their heads and spoil their aim. Morrison dove into the doorway beside her, breathing hard. "Nice shooting, Doc. You kept their heads down just long enough." Sarah was already checking Peterson's condition. His pulse was barely perceptible, and his breathing was becoming agonal. They had maybe 2 minutes before he went into cardiac arrest. "We need to move now," she said urgently. "He's dying." Morrison peered around the corner toward the alley that led to the landing zone. "It's about 200 meters through that alley, then we'll be at the helicopter. But I can see at least 4 fighters positioned to block our route." Sarah looked at Peterson, then at Morrison. "Can you carry him alone for 2 minutes?" Morrison nodded. "If I have to." "Why?" Sarah unslung her rifle and checked her remaining ammunition. 1 full magazine, plus 6 rounds in the weapon. 26 bullets to clear a path through 4 Taliban fighters across 200 meters of narrow alley. "Because I'm going to clear the route," she said. Before Morrison could object, Sarah was moving. She sprinted down the alley, staying low, using whatever cover was available. The Taliban fighters saw her coming and opened fire. But they were shooting at a small, fast-moving target in poor light. Their bullets sparked off walls and shattered windows, but Sarah kept moving. She reached the first firing position. A Taliban fighter crouched behind a pile of rubble. The man was focused on the alley mouth, waiting for targets to appear. He never saw Sarah approaching from his flank. Sarah put 2 bullets center mass. The fighter collapsed without making a sound. The second position was more challenging. 2 fighters in an upper-story window, with good fields of fire down the alley. Sarah couldn't approach them directly, without exposing herself to their weapons. Instead, she found a position across the alley where she could see into their window. The angle was difficult, shooting upward at nearly 45 degrees. But Sarah had trained for exactly this kind of shot. She steadied her rifle against a wall, controlled her breathing, and squeezed the trigger twice. Both fighters fell back from the window. The 4th fighter was the smartest. He had positioned himself at the far end of the alley, behind good cover, with multiple escape routes. When he saw Sarah eliminating his teammates, he began falling back toward the landing zone, probably planning to warn other fighters about the approaching Americans. Sarah couldn't let him escape. She sprinted down the alley, pushing herself to close the distance before the fighter could get away. The man saw her coming and turned to fight. Bringing up his AK-47, Sarah dropped to one knee, raised her rifle, and fired her last round just as the Taliban fighter pulled his trigger. The bullet took the man in the head, dropping him instantly. His weapon fired wildly into the air as he fell. Sarah stood in the sudden silence, breathing hard, her rifle empty. Behind her, she could hear Morrison approaching with Peterson. The route to the helicopter was clear, but Sarah had no ammunition left. If they encountered more fighters, she would have to use her pistol or fight with her bare hands. "Doc," Morrison called out. "You did it. The route's clear." Sarah turned to help with Peterson, but as she did, she heard the distinctive whine of an incoming mortar round. Somewhere in the village, a Taliban mortar team had finally gotten their weapon into action and was beginning to drop high-explosive rounds near the helicopter landing zone. The first round impacted about 100 meters away, close enough to feel the concussion, far enough away to avoid immediate danger. But Sarah knew that mortar teams adjusted their fire rapidly, walking their rounds closer to the target with each shot. They had maybe 30 seconds before the landing zone became too dangerous for helicopter operations. "Run!" Sarah shouted, grabbing Peterson's other arm. Together, she and Morrison carried their wounded teammate toward the sound of helicopter rotors, racing against time, racing against death, racing against an enemy that was closing in from every direction. The landing zone was just ahead, marked by the infrared strobe lights that were invisible to the naked eye but showed up clearly in their night vision goggles. The Black Hawk helicopter sat on the ground, its engines running, its crew chief standing in the door with a machine gun, ready to provide covering fire. But between them and safety lay the final 50 meters of open ground, swept by enemy fire, targeted by enemy mortars, and defended only by Sarah's courage and Morrison's determination to bring their teammate home alive. The medic who had discovered her talent for taking lives was about to learn whether that talent was enough to save one. The second mortar round impacted 20 meters closer to the helicopter. Sarah felt the shock wave wash over her as she and Morrison carried Peterson across the open ground toward salvation. Shrapnel whined through the air above their heads, and the helicopter's crew chief began laying down suppressive fire with his door-mounted machine gun. "Faster!" Morrison shouted over the noise. "They're walking those rounds right onto the landing zone." Sarah's legs burned as she pushed herself to keep pace. Peterson was dead weight between them, his body limp and cold. She could barely detect a pulse in his neck, and his breathing had become so shallow it was almost unnoticeable. They were carrying a dying man toward a helicopter that might not be there in another 30 seconds. The third mortar round landed just as they reached the helicopter. The explosion threw dirt and debris across the landing zone, and Sarah felt the concussion knock the breath from her lungs. But they were at the aircraft now, and hands were reaching out to help them load Peterson aboard. "Get him inside," Morrison yelled to the crew chief. "Urgent surgical." Sarah climbed into the helicopter behind Peterson's stretcher and immediately went to work. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, starting IV lines, checking his pulse, assessing his breathing. The familiar routine of emergency medicine steadied her nerves and focused her mind on what she could control. Blood pressure, 60/40, and dropping. She called out to Morrison, who was coordinating with the pilot. "Pulse 140 and thready. He's in profound shock. We need to get him to a trauma center now, or he's not going to make it." Morrison spoke rapidly into his radio, calling for immediate medical evacuation to the nearest combat support hospital. The pilot was already spooling up the engines to full power, preparing for immediate departure. But as the helicopter began to lift off, Sarah heard the distinctive crack of sniper fire. Through the open door, she could see muzzle flashes from multiple positions around the landing zone. The Taliban had brought up more fighters, and they were making a desperate attempt to bring down the escaping aircraft. "Taking fire," the pilot reported over the intercom. "Multiple small arms, at least 2 sniper positions." The helicopter lurched as the pilot took evasive action, climbing rapidly while jinxing left and right to avoid enemy fire. Sarah braced herself over Peterson's stretcher, trying to continue her medical treatment, while the aircraft bucked and rolled through the night sky. A bullet punched through the helicopter's thin aluminum skin just inches from Sarah's head, exiting through the roof in a shower of sparks. Another round shattered one of the side windows, filling the cabin with wind and noise. "We're taking hits," the crew chief reported, "but no major damage yet." Sarah worked frantically to stabilize Peterson. She pushed fluids to maintain his blood pressure, administered pain medication to prevent him from going into shock from the painful transport, and monitored his vital signs constantly. But even with her best efforts, she could see that he was losing the fight. His skin was gray and cold, his pulse was becoming weaker and more irregular. His breathing was so shallow that she had to look closely to see his chest rising and falling. Without blood transfusions and immediate surgery, Peterson would die before they reached the hospital. "How long to the trauma center?" she asked Morrison. Morrison checked with the pilot. 15 minutes at current speed. Maybe 12 if we push it. Sarah looked down at Peterson's pale face. 12 minutes might as well be 12 hours. He didn't have that long. "I need to do something I've never done before," she told Morrison. Morrison stared at her. "A what?" "Direct blood transfusion. From me to him. It's dangerous, but it's the only way to get enough blood into him to keep his heart pumping until we reach surgery." "Doc, that's insane. You could kill both of you." Sarah was already rolling up her sleeve. He's going to die anyway if we don't try. And I'm O negative. Universal donor. My blood will work with his. She pulled out a field transfusion kit, something she had never used outside of training scenarios. The procedure was dangerous under ideal conditions. Attempting it in the back of a helicopter under fire, with no laboratory support and no way to monitor for adverse reactions, was almost suicidal. But Peterson was her teammate, her responsibility. She had sworn an oath to preserve life, and she was going to honor that oath, no matter what the cost. Sarah inserted an IV catheter into her own arm, then connected it to Peterson's IV line with sterile tubing. Her blood began flowing directly from her circulatory system into his, bypassing all the normal safety procedures of blood banking and compatibility testing. "Doc, are you sure about this?" Morrison asked, watching with concern as Sarah began the transfusion. "No," Sarah admitted, "but I'm doing it anyway." She could feel her blood flowing out of her body and into Peterson's. It was a strange sensation. Watching her life force literally flowing into another person, her pulse rate increased as her body tried to compensate for the blood loss. She began to feel lightheaded, but she forced herself to concentrate on monitoring Peterson's condition. Almost immediately, she could see improvement. Peterson's pulse strengthened slightly. His blood pressure stabilized. His breathing became less labored. The direct transfusion was working, buying them precious time. But Sarah was paying the price. She could feel herself weakening as her blood volume decreased. Her vision began to tunnel slightly, and she had to grip the stretcher rail to keep from falling over. "Doc, you're giving him too much," Morrison said urgently. "You're going to pass out." "Not yet," Sarah said through gritted teeth. "He needs more. Just a little more." She continued the transfusion for another 2 minutes, pushing herself to the edge of consciousness. When she finally clamped off the line, she was dizzy and nauseated, but Peterson's vital signs had stabilized enough to give him a fighting chance. "There," she said weakly. "That should hold him until we reach the hospital." Morrison looked at her with something approaching awe. "Doc, in all my years in special operations, I have never seen anything like what you've done tonight. You saved Peterson's life 3 times. First, when you cleared the route to him. Second, when you fought your way out of that village. And third, just now, with that transfusion." Sarah leaned back against the helicopter's wall, exhausted. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the firefight was wearing off, and she was beginning to realize what she had done. In one night, she had transformed from a medic to a sniper, to a combat soldier, to a battlefield surgeon. She had taken lives and saved lives, sometimes within minutes of each other. "How many did I kill tonight?" she asked quietly. Morrison was silent for a moment, calculating. 8 confirmed, maybe more. You took out an entire machine gun team, eliminated the fighters who were blocking our escape route, and probably saved the entire team by suppressing that mortar position." Sarah nodded, trying to process the information. 8 human beings were dead because of her actions. 8 people who had woken up that morning thinking they would see another sunset. 8 families who would never see their sons, husbands, or brothers again. But then she looked at Peterson, whose chest was rising and falling with steady, regular breaths. She thought about Rodriguez and Bradley, who were probably already in surgery, having their wounds repaired by skilled trauma surgeons. She thought about Morrison and the rest of the team, who were alive because she had found the courage to fight when fighting was necessary. "Doc." Peterson's voice was barely a whisper, but his eyes were open and focused. "Thank you." Sarah leaned forward, checking his pulse. It was stronger now, more regular. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Thank me when you're holding your daughter." Peterson managed a weak smile. "When I get home, I'm going to tell her about the woman who saved her daddy's life. I'm going to tell her that heroes come in all shapes and sizes, and sometimes they're medics who learn to shoot when they have to." The helicopter was descending now, approaching the combat support hospital. Sarah could see the bright lights of the trauma bay, the medical teams waiting to take over Peterson's care, professional surgeons and nurses who could do things for him that she never could. But she had done what she needed to do. She had kept him alive long enough to reach them. As the helicopter touched down, medical personnel swarmed aboard. Peterson was transferred to a proper stretcher and wheeled rapidly toward the trauma center. Sarah tried to follow, but her legs gave out from blood loss and exhaustion. Morrison caught her as she collapsed. "Easy, Doc," he said gently. "You've done enough for one night. Let someone else take care of you for a change." Sarah found herself on a stretcher being wheeled into the hospital. As she passed Peterson's trauma bay, she could see the surgical team working on him with the same intensity and skill that she had learned to bring to combat. His vital signs on the monitor were strong and stable. He was going to make it. 3 days later, Sarah sat in the hospital cafeteria, her arm in a sling from the IV site where she had given blood to Peterson. The transfusion had left her anemic and weak, but she was recovering quickly. Peterson was already talking about returning to duty, though that wouldn't happen for at least 3 months while his wounds healed. Rodriguez and Bradley had both been released from the hospital and were expected to make full recoveries. The mission, despite the heavy resistance, had been successful. The Taliban commander had been captured, along with valuable intelligence about enemy operations in the region. Morrison approached her table, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "How are you feeling, Doc?" "PC. Better," Sarah said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "The doctors say I'll be cleared for duty next week." Morrison sat down across from her. "About that, the team has been talking, and we have a proposal for you." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "What kind of proposal?" "We want you to cross-train as a sniper. Keep your medical rating, but add precision shooting to your skill set." "What you did that night." Morrison paused, searching for words. "Doc, you have a gift. A talent that could save a lot of lives in the right circumstances." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the night that had changed everything. She thought about the Taliban fighters she had killed, about Peterson's pale face on the helicopter, about the moment when she had realized that sometimes saving lives meant taking them. "I swore an oath to do no harm," she said finally. Morrison nodded. "You did. But you also swore an oath to preserve life. Sometimes, those two things come into conflict. Sometimes you have to make impossible choices. What matters is that you make them for the right reasons." Sarah sipped her coffee, considering. "What do the guys think about it? Having a medic, who's also a sniper?" Morrison smiled. "Peterson put it best. He said he wants to serve with someone who will fight heaven and hell to bring him home alive. The rest of the team feels the same way." 2012. Bud. Sarah looked out the window at the Afghan landscape, thinking about the future. She thought about other missions, other wounded teammates, other impossible situations where someone would need to make the choice between doing harm and allowing harm to be done. "Okay," she said finally, "but I have one condition." "Name it." "I stay a medic first. Always. If there's a choice between taking a shot and saving a life, I save the life, every time." Morrison extended his hand. "Deal." Sarah shook it, knowing that she was agreeing to become something she had never expected to be. A warrior healer. Someone who could deal death with precision and compassion in equal measure. 6 months later, Hospital Corpsman First Class Sarah Chen graduated from the Navy's elite sniper school, the first woman to complete the program while maintaining her medical rating. Her instructors said they had never seen natural shooting ability combined with such tactical intelligence and emotional control. But Sarah knew the truth. Her skills hadn't come from any natural gift. They had come from a night in Afghanistan when she had faced an impossible choice and decided that sometimes the only way to save a life was to take one. The SEALs who served with her never forgot what they had witnessed that night. They told the story to new team members, to other medics, to anyone who would listen. They spoke of a small woman who had transformed from healer to warrior in the space of a single firefight, who had proven that courage came in all forms, and that sometimes the greatest act of mercy was the willingness to show no mercy at all. Peterson kept his promise. When he returned home, he told his daughter about the woman who had saved her daddy's life. He told her that heroes were ordinary people who found extraordinary courage when it mattered most. He told her that sometimes the people who healed were the same people who had to fight, and that there was no contradiction in that. Sarah Chen continued to serve with the SEALs for another 4 years, earning decorations for valor and saving dozens of lives through her medical skills and her marksmanship. She retired as a senior chief petty officer and went on to become a trauma surgeon, bringing the lessons she had learned in combat to civilian medicine. But every year, on the anniversary of that night in Afghanistan, she received the same message from Peterson, Rodriguez, Bradley, Morrison, and the other members of SEAL Team 7. "Thank you for bringing us home." And every year, Sarah replied with the same message: "Thank you for showing me who I really am." The fury that had transformed a medic into a sniper had also revealed something deeper. The unbreakable bonds between people who trust each other with their lives, and the courage to become whatever you need to become to honor that trust. The SEALs had sworn they would always remember her fury, but what they really remembered was her love.